Pick your top 5. 2 sides to it.
Seriously?
That's why I had the caveat you do.
Oh, come on. 5?
Yeah, come on.
Can we get 20 checked out already? Only on 25.
There's 2 sides to the paper.
There's 2 sides.
Don't use up your 5 on the first half. So Mac, we're doing, out of the 60 characteristics you took last week,
Yeah.
to identify the 5 that are your most difficult issues. And you
Is that my
can-
inside voice?
You can go to 10 if you didn't.
Check, check, check. Oh.
The impulses you've already talked about, ticked off the first day.
I hope my hair is not going to be annoying. No, you're not sitting that high.
Okay, how did everybody do? You don't have to share them at this moment. I'll tell you why I had you do it in a moment. So I'm Tim, and I heard all your names. Doesn't mean I will remember all your names on the first day, but be patient with me, I'll get them. Just to give you a sense of, you had phase 1 the last 2 weeks, and hopefully you got a restful weekend. And I think from what Kim and Britt told me, you realize that dealing with some of this emotional pain stuff can get really tiring. And that's a very normal thing. When we started REACT, I had worked for 13 years in a secular treatment center. And basically every day you had morning workshops, afternoon group therapy. And what I had found over the years, especially as I started taking people into deeper stuff, is by Wednesday they're exhausted. And so to try to force them on to do group at Wednesday afternoon, Thursday, Friday, they were just, so I said, what's the point? You can only retain what you can soak in, and if you're saturated already, it's just too much. So what we did with REACT was to do the first 2-3 days of the week to be fairly intense, And then the last 2 days to be much more activity-oriented, sharing, that kind of thing. And it seems to be working quite well. Usually by Wednesday, people are still exhausted. And you just really work with them to take care of themselves, because with exhaustion and stuff getting stirred up from triggers, and that can be, basically we're taking them into a vulnerable place and making them more liable or subject to relapse or resorting to old behaviors. So that's part of what we have to be alert to as teachers and counselors, just as to where people are at and how well they're coping with what we're doing. So when we come to phase 2, which I will be doing this week and next, what we do is we take the complex trauma and we start digging in. And so my role in teaching that is really to be kind of alert to where people need to go. And so part of what I do when I start the first week of the complex trauma phase 2, it is just called complex trauma. And so what I do to start with is I do a review on complex trauma, and I'll do that with you in a bit, but I also get them to write down their main issues. So that I then go, okay, how many people put shame as still their main issue? And I might get 5, 6 hands go up. Okay, how many got fear of abandonment? Oh, 8 hands. And I start keeping track of what are the main issues. And you'll find, usually with this particular group of clients, there will be 3 or 4 issues that just really are common to most of them. And so then I'll basically, on the fly, create a workshop on that area. Now you're drawing on all your years of experience, but I want in that first week to help them realize complex trauma. We're going to review it, but now I want to go to your deepest issues and give you the tools to begin working on them. So that's what we're going to do this week, is really start digging into the complex trauma stuff. And hopefully for you, you'll be learning what to teach, but you'll also be dealing with your stuff and processing at a bunch of different levels. So I love to teach interactively. I don't like just teaching by a monologue. And so most of phase 2 workshops, I have a body of material that I kind of know I would like to get to, but I'm really open to going on bunny trails as the people need to go on bunny trails. So the workshop on this 8-month or 8-week period of phase 2 on shame might be totally different from the one the next cycle, because of the questions asked, because of what people are struggling with. So there'll be definitely some common foundational pieces that will be communicated, but there will be all kinds of different bunny trails that you just have to be alert to. So you'll just gradually accumulate that kind of background and knowledge to be able to go with clients where they need to go. Okay, so just to give you an idea of how we break up phase 2, what we do on Mondays is we just summarize what they learned in phase 1. So if it's on anger or shame or conflict, we just go back over what they did in phase 1 and add a few extra pieces that tie in the complex trauma stuff. Tuesday, what I then do is really explore that issue through the lens of complex trauma. The brain, all the different chemicals in the brain. And what I do with each of those issues is, and I can write this down for you just so you have it. So let's say they have a fear of abandonment, okay, which is a very common one. So I'll do, what are the causes of your fear of abandonment? And they can fill up the whole board as you begin to explore and probe. And then what I would do is, okay, what will trigger that today? And that, you can fill up another board with that. Because it could be somebody just not answering a text that they sent to them, and all of a sudden they feel they're mad at me, and they just go off into that. And then I go into what is your pattern once this is triggered. And so you're going to have certain thought patterns. And so that'll go from obsessive thinking. So your brain just spins, spins, spins. 2, lies that you believe. So you jump the worst case scenario, you make all these conclusions and assumptions, or you just go down certain paths that you've been down many times before that are negative, beating yourself up, all of those kind of things. So I really want them on Tuesdays to increase their self-awareness and to see how the complex trauma has affected them and to learn their pattern and what triggers it. And then there's going to be emotional pattern. So if they had fear of abandonment, all they're feeling at that moment is fear of abandonment. But I want them to realize there's probably other emotions happening at the same time. So very quickly, anybody? What other emotions might be happening if your fear of abandonment got triggered? Anger, rejection. Some would go to hopeless, who cares, what's the point? And they go there in a heartbeat. So I want them to understand where their emotional world goes. And then I want them to go into their behavior patterns. So some will go begin to isolate. Some will begin to lash out at people, become very needy with people, and I want them to begin to see their activity patterns. And so any of the 60 issues, basically you can follow this, because every single one of them, for them, will be fit into this, and it's a big part of the self-awareness. And for most of them, there's going to be their own unique stuff that nobody else has. So what I like to do, if I was to say, okay, what triggers your fear of abandonment? So let's just do this very quickly here. So what would trigger your fear of abandonment if that's one of your issues? So how many had fear of abandonment as an issue? Okay, so what kind of things might trigger that?
Perceived withdrawal.
Okay, perceived withdrawal. So with a lot of people, I think you're aware, you need to be able to quickly give them an illustration of that concept. So it would be, you're talking to somebody and all of a sudden they seem distracted. Or they look somewhere else, or they start walking away from you a little bit. All of those things perceived withdrawal, and you go, what does that do to my thinking? They don't like me, they're not going to talk to me again. Then I go to all my emotions, and then I might do certain things, behaviors. Okay, what other things would trigger abandonment feelings?
Maybe your partner leaves after an argument, just walks out.
Exactly. Yeah. So conflict for many people is huge when it comes to abandonment, especially in how their partner responds. So if they just, I got to get out of here, they might only be needing to go to calm down, but you're going, they're gone. Yeah. Or they say, I can't talk about this, or don't want to talk about this, it's too much, etc. Okay? Other abandonment triggers.
Workaholic, like
A
if your
workaholic,
spouse is an
yeah.
alcoholic.
Exactly, so they never seem to want to be home. And when they're home, they're always doing something. So what's that say about me? Yeah. Okay? Or they talk to somebody else who's a female. And then you go, oh, is he flirting? Is he whatever? And is he getting ready to leave me? Is he getting somebody? All of those kinds of things. And if they've been cheated on, etc., that can be a huge trigger. Okay? Other triggers? Brad? We are working off of this sheet. So for some people, if somebody criticizes them or gives them negative feedback, that just sends them right into abandonment stuff. Okay? If somebody sets a boundary with them, so you're texting, you say, please don't text me so much, then they go, oh, it's done, abandoned, and all of those things. So you can, and what I like to do is just let them think, and I'll give them some stuff here and there about triggers, just to spur on their thinking, but they'll gradually get into more and more and more and more, and then they'll go, wow, I can't believe how many things trigger my abandonment. So part of what I hope for, and the clients don't like this, but part of what I hope for on Tuesday is that by the end of the day they'll be overwhelmed with how messed up they are. And that's basically it. I don't want to leave them there as a cruel joke, But I realized that to ever heal, you have to have self-awareness that goes really deep. And so that is Tuesday. So what you'll get with a lot of clients in their first week of phase 2, or their first couple weeks of phase 2, is you'll start dealing with this and they'll want to go, so what do I got to do to fix it? I just say that's Wednesday. And now whenever I say that's Wednesday, they just laugh because all the older clients know Wednesdays when we get into the 2. And so we'll spend the whole day on what does healthy look like in whatever area. And so with the fear of abandonment, what kind of things would I need to build into my life to deal with the triggers, to stop the patterns, to stop the thinking, to stop the emotions, to stop the behaviors. And part of it is you need to de-escalate. So in the moment when you're triggered, you have the massive de-escalation. And then outside of those trigger times, you have to have other things that are helping you heal and grow. You can't just focus only on the triggers. So that's Wednesday. And then Thursday we spend letting people share about how the week's affected them. Often we'll have questions or activities that will help them process stuff and just work through stuff. So activities that are fun, activities that are just opportunities to share, open up, process the week. And then on a Friday, what I do is 2 things. I go, any questions from the week that haven't been covered, or anything that's come up from this topic this week that has created questions in you or made you realize things that you need to look at more closely. And so I open it up as this is your question day. And then if somebody's graduating that day, I give them a chance to ask questions about anything in regards to recovery and complex trauma. So it's a very open-ended day, and it gives them a chance to resolve a little bit of stuff from the week that maybe didn't get resolved Monday to Thursday. Okay, any questions on that? Okay.
Can I have
The 50 characters or 60 characteristics?
If we're teaching the class and you, like I'm not sure how you do it, do you just go down there and then sort of pick one for that week, and you don't have so many weeks, so?
Okay,
How do you do that?
So week 1 is complex trauma.
Right?
Week 2 is a whole week on shame.
So any of these issues through the lens of complex trauma.
Exactly. Yeah. So week 3 is anger. The whole week is on anger. Week 4 is on emotions. And you could easily spend 2 weeks on emotions. It's such a big topic and there's so many emotions. Week 5 is conflict and kind of all the unhealthy approaches, what are healthy. Week 6 is relationships. And again, I leave that one fairly open because it's just, and they got more questions around the relationship week and the conflict week than any others because it's all relationship based. And most of them have children relationship issues, parent relationship issues, partner relationship issues. So you get to tons of very personal, in the moment, here's what I'm dealing with now type questions. But I usually, again, with the relationship week, I just start teaching some of the basics again, and then stuff starts.
Coming out, and then you use that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And then week 9 is boundaries the whole week. Or sorry, week 7 is boundaries the whole week, and week 8 is grief the whole week. So as you can see, we don't have a chance to get through all 60. That's why in the first week, I just try to get them, if there's any, besides the other 7 weeks following, is there any topics that are really, they're struggling with? Okay, so here's basically what I would do. So here's danger, pain, or a problem. And what I want to emphasize with them is every child faces danger, pain, problems. Okay? Healthy home You have parents who will give you the tools and support so you go through them so that problems, pain, and danger always become positive. You learn from them, you grow from them, you get more tools from them, and you come out the other side stronger and better. So that's kind of God's design. That's how we learn and that's how we grow. What complex trauma is you face danger, pain every day, but there's no solution. Nobody's there to help you, and usually the ones that should be helping you are creating it. And so you're left with the option of fight, or freeze. And so that's just a child trying to survive. So one of the things we emphasize over and over again is you chose fight, flight, and freeze, not because you just wanted to mess up your life, because you're a little kid trying to survive. This isn't you trying to do bad things. So be easy on yourself. This is a child in survival mode. So that's the first thing that I want them to understand. But then I say the more intense the danger, the more intense the pain, then the more intense the response needed to be. And so that's where you get that nanosecond escalation if your fear gets triggered. If danger or pain happens, the greater the pain, the greater the explosion, the greater the trigger, the escalation, because it's the brain trying to protect you. So then, one of the things, and I'll do it over here, is I just make a series of upwards arrows, and it goes, here's your complex trauma. So the greater the complex trauma, so it's to recognize there's degrees of complex trauma from a mild to very severe. So the greater complex trauma, the greater the shame. So a child that's been neglected because dad's a workaholic will have some shame because they will internalize that and say, Dad's working or choosing me because it must be something wrong with me. Work is more important than me. And so there will be some shame, but a child that's physically, sexually abused, they're going to say, I must be a total screw up to be treated this way. So the intensity comes, okay? Then you get responses both in connection with complex trauma and now with shame as well. So then, the greater the anger. So part of what happens here with this being triggered is the cortisol gets released in the brain. So that is the brain chemical to give you the adrenaline rush so you can fight harder, flee faster, or shut her all down. So it is God's defense thing to give you the energy to fight, flight, or freeze to survive. And so the greater the danger, the greater the shot of cortisol and adrenaline. And that's what causes the massive escalation. And with that, cortisol also connects to anger. So cortisol gives you the anger to fight, and it gives you the anger to flee quickly. And so the greater you've been hurt, the greater the anger, the greater the shame, the greater the anger, but a lot of the anger starts to get turned in on yourself. I hate myself, I'm a screw up, and self-harm, etc. So that begins to come out of that. And then the greater the anxiety. Because what happens now is my whole work, down here, there's parts of your world that were stable and safe. Up here, there's nothing safe. And so down here, you have a little bit of anxiety when you're in certain situations. Up here, you have constant anxiety and very severe. And so cortisol and anxiety and anger all connect because when anxiety is there, cortisol is released because that's the fear chemical and all of that happens. Is that making sense? Okay? And then sometimes this next line can take a whole morning. It depends where the clients are. But what I want them to understand is how it affects your mental health. So down here, everybody all the way up will have depression and anxiety. That's just part of complex trauma. And I do emphasize that there is some depression, anxiety that is genetic. But what research is showing is that much of the anxiety and depression is complex trauma. Because who wants to live feeling that they're a total useless person and unlovable and unvaluable? And who wants to live in constant danger with no solution? Okay? And then what I begin to do is start to go up the things. So as complex trauma goes up, then you get into ADHD. So a child can't concentrate at school because they're worried about what's going to be happening at home that night. So it was actually Gabor Mate here in Vancouver that said every ADHD kid he worked with had trauma. So he started to make this connection, and he got a lot of criticism at first, but it's becoming quite accepted that much of ADHD comes from anxiety or trauma. So another way to look at that is your most extreme form of mental health response to severe trauma is dissociative identity disorder. So a total fracturing of the self, a total disconnect. So you get your multiple personalities, etc. And you will get people like that that will come. But what I want them to understand is that all of this here is actually there's disconnect happening. So ADHD, they're now saying it's actually you're disconnecting. Living in the present is too hard to do. You just keep wanting to disconnect. And so you're having trouble focusing because of that. And so everybody will understand the disconnect that happens when they start to realize, when I cry, I get laughed at or punished. I'm going to stop crying, so I'm going to disconnect from that part of me. And then I get in trouble every time I show fear, and I get laughed at, so I'm going to disconnect from that part of me. And they just keep disconnecting from greater and greater parts of them till they just become a shell. Okay? So that's what begins to happen, and the greater the trauma, the more disconnect is necessary. Okay? Then what comes up next, and this is where it starts to get very complex with people, is your borderline personality disorder. Everybody familiar with borderline personality? Terrible title, but basically what it is now understood is it's an extreme reaction to abandonment. So as soon as I have the slightest threat or trigger that I might get abandoned, I go through the roof. And I become irrational, and then afterward I hate myself. So borderline personality said there's these rapid mood swings, that was the original thing, and then self-hatred afterwards. And so there's no emotional regulation in there because of all of that. And then they began to understand this is an abandonment issue. And what was really frustrating to psychiatrists was there's no pill for borderline personality. And so now they use dialectical behavior therapy because it de-escalates, grounding, and then mindfulness. And so all of that we'll look at. But so a lot of people, I would say at least 50% of addicts have borderline personality. Undiagnosed, most of them. Borderline personality, what makes it tricky and hard to detect is you don't really show it if you're not in a relationship. You can be the coolest cucumber on the planet, but stick you in an intimate relationship and all of a sudden you're a different animal. Because all of your abandonment stuff can now be triggered because you're taking the risk of opening yourself up. And so that's when borderline comes out. And then above that, you get narcissistic personality disorder. And then above that, you get your psychopath. Or your sociopath. So what I want them to realize is a psychopath and a narcissist, they have tons and tons of shame. They hate themselves, but their way of trying to deal with it is to compensate by trying to be better than everybody else and to not feel anything. Not have any connection, but be smooth, all of that. Some people respond to deep shame by being very down on themselves, hate themselves, super needy, all of that. But some go to the overcompensation in the other direction. but it's all a response to huge amounts of shame. Is that all making sense to you? Any questions on that? So,
Can you go from like shame to psychopathic view? Can we go through each phase?
good question. I think for most people, this is a process. So basically by the time you get to psychopath, like what you're doing with each one here, borderline narcissist, you're shutting down more and more and more. Hurts too much to feel, hurts too much to be in touch with myself, hurts too much to have a conscience, all of those things. Way more negative emotions than positive emotions, hurts too much even to live, shut down, till you get to the point where you just harden your heart to everything. And then you have no remorse, no empathy, nothing. But that is a gradual build-up. Yeah. Okay, any other questions on that? So what you can see is, once people begin to understand borderline and narcissistic personality and they begin to see themselves or their partner, then you have these long conversations and lots of questions around that because it just is so much in their reality. So that can lead to very, end up being a whole morning for people. And then one of the things that I asked Britt and Kim if you covered last week, so you guys did narcissistic personality test, okay?
Yeah.
But you didn't do the mirror test? Okay, so narcissistic personality, what the research is saying is, so you got a narcissist up here, and then you have a mirror, which is they're attracted to somebody down here. So they overcompensate by trying to be better than everybody, and they're compensated to, they're attracted to somebody that thinks they're inferior to everybody. So you have a super superior attracted to a super inferior. And that's how they live. So that becomes a codependent relationship where they need each other but begin to hate each other. And they feed off each other in a very unhealthy thing. And so what you'll get is people begin to connect themselves and their partner to the narcissist or the mirror. And then that just gets their head going. Okay. Next thing that I do is the greater the pain and danger, so you have that nanosecond escalation, 0 to 1,000 in a nanosecond. But then the brain says, why wait for pain? Let's start fight, flight earlier. So now let's do it when there's any distress or any uncomfortable emotion. So now, I'm not going to wait till I'm in pain. I'm going to wait till I feel stressed. Do I feel a bit anxious? Do I feel embarrassed? Do I feel angry? Do I feel a bit unsettled? Do I feel insecure? Pick any negative emotion, and I do not want to sit in it. Because what your brain is saying is negative emotions lead to pain. So let's not hang around and wait for the pain. Let's get out now. So it backs up the escape hatch to an earlier time. Okay? And then the brain says, why wait till I have an uncomfortable emotion? Let's go to hypervigilance. So when we walk into a room, let's check for danger. And so what you're training the brain to do now is to look for negative. So you're not training the brain to look for accurate, you're training the brain to look for negative. And therefore that sets in play that negative focus. Okay? So everybody will be getting this, because then they know as soon as I see danger, a hint of danger, I'm out of here. But then the brain goes, let's go further. So this is where you take an adaptive system and it becomes maladaptive. So what the brain says now is, let's just jump to the worst case scenario in every situation. So they showed children from healthy homes and complex trauma homes pictures of human faces. So they had one with a picture of happy faces, both kids said that's happy. One was sad, both kids said sad. One angry, both kids said angry. And then they showed up a flat face with no emotion. Guess what the complex trauma kid said? that person's anger. So what it's doing now is reading in negative to where it's not. So you're jumping to a negative conclusion based on what your history, and therefore what you think is a logical conclusion, but it could be very distorted. Okay? So all of this is designed. Cortisol was God's gift to give us energy to keep safe. Okay? But it was designed to be quickly resolved. So you get out of danger, cortisol stops, you go back to love-based living. Trusting, giving, opening up, all of that, okay? So it was a short-term emergency system that was built into us. Complex trauma keeps that happening every day. And so now, there's no resolution for it. So what you do is you start backing up escape points. So guess what happens here? You meet somebody and they say, I really like you, what goes on in your brain?
Run.
What do you want? Run. They're just saying that because they don't know me. So you now have a whole system that says run. And you will make everything work to fit that system. So now you live in fight-flight mode as your way of surviving when you no longer need to survive. And that's what sets you up to have your relationships don't work, because now you refuse to trust because you got history. You refuse to drop your guard and walls and take your mask off because all your history said that's a bad idea. And so now you say, I have to stay in survival mode so I can never have a healthy relationship. Any questions on that? Okay? We're still warming up. So where I go next with people, and this, before I go to that, what I then do is just review the 4 environments that create this complex trauma. So there's the abuse environment, so physical, emotional, verbal, sexual, and depending on my audience, I will often talk about spiritual abuse. And so that's any religion that uses God as a big bat. If you do something bad, you're in trouble. That kind of approach. So it's a fear-based type of motivation. And then abandonment. And I talk within the abandonment one of a child that is put into we call it CFS, Child and Family Services in Manitoba. I don't know what you call it here. But you're put into the Children's Aid, or you're put up to adoption. And so you're literally abandoned. But then I also talk about having like a parent who died. So they didn't willfully abandon you. It was just the circumstances, but it felt like they abandoned you. And so you still perceive it that way. And then more and more research happening around the effect of divorce on children. And so you might still have both parents in your life, but you feel abandoned. And what I want to emphasize with that is it's not so much a geographical abandonment, it's your stability's gone. So it's an abandonment that affects your rock. And so you no longer have that rock. And so once they begin to do that and think about that, it can lead to lots of insights for them. And then the third is the neglect. And that's the parent with their own addiction, the parent with mental health problems and they're super depressed and just can't be there emotionally. So the point is that neglect, all your physical needs might be met, but it's your emotional needs that aren't being met. And when your emotional needs aren't being met, neglect feels like abandonment. Because you're facing the world alone. You're facing problems alone. And so it's the exact same effect. And that's why it's still a very big complex trauma. I don't know if Kim and Britt showed you pictures of the child development as far as the brain. So neglect and how much smaller the brain is than a child that's nurtured. So neglect is a big one. And then we can go in a bunch of different directions with the neglect one. We can go to, you have a sibling who is very ill. So your brother gets cancer, so mom and dad give them all the attention, and you feel like you don't matter. Or you're in a big family. You got 10 siblings, and you're just kind of the leftovers, and you never feel you get mom and dad's attention very much. So there's lots of subtle different ways neglect can happen. And what I find as I'm teaching this is people just start saying, what about this, what about this? And they start going through their own stuff. And that leads to lots of stuff getting stirred up, but for the first time they can talk about it and begin to make sense out of it. And that's what our goal is. And then the fourth one is the 12 needs not met. And the idea is they're not met consistently. Because most kids will have some needs that were met sometimes, it's just that they weren't met consistently. And what I do with this one, so we've got physical needs, emotional needs, relational needs, and spiritual needs. And so if any of those needs weren't met consistently, then there's something in you saying, why wasn't that need met? Is it because I'm not good enough? And it starts the shame message whenever you have an unmet need. A quick summary one for them is children have two big needs. One to be totally accepted for who they are, and one to be valued and respected. So if a child's laughed at or teased because of their nose or their braces, or they're picked on because they're short and stubby, a little chunky, then all of a sudden they begin to realize not being totally accepted, that affected me. Or their brother got straight A's and they came home with straight A's and 1 B, and their parents got on them. They didn't encourage them, they just focused on the B. Why didn't you get an A like your brother? And so just that acceptance one, they begin to realize when I don't feel accepted, I then feel on guard. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells because I don't know if somebody's going to tease me or make fun of me or put pressure on me to change. So those, I recap those for everybody just so they have that again. And again, it depends on the group. Sometimes they just want to dig deeper into these things and start asking questions about their neglect or abandonment. And what you'll find around the adoption one is, I think, very important. I don't know the exact, I don't know if anybody's done a research on it, but my guess from working with addicts, I would say about half of the people that are adopted ended up addicts. Anybody know why? Exactly. Abandonment. So it's the two people that gave me physical birth should be the two people who love me more than anybody. That should be built into their DNA. And if they didn't want me, then nobody wants me.
At a primal level, right?
It's at a very primal level. So what a lot of clients will say is, but I was adopted at birth. I don't remember anything. I went into a good family. Like, I don't understand it. And all I do is, because it's hard to give kind of such a black and white answer that answers all their questions. It's just that for many children who are adopted, as they get older, they wonder why. It's just at a very often subconscious level. They feel something must have been wrong with them. They maybe never put that into words, never to conscious thought, but it's there at a very deep level. And that is part of their complex trauma long before they had any physical memories. And some connect with it right away. They just break down and start crying. You'll get the odd one, though, that ended up in a good home, who felt loved, and the adoption didn't seem to have that big effect on them. And I've had a couple cases where they've done very well and adjusted. It's just the question in their mind is, why am I an addict? Like, how do I reconcile that if I had such a wonderful home? And so gradually, usually in the first couple of weeks, they're not open to even go there. But over time, they gradually open up to exploring that a little bit.
Does it make a difference if they're adopted at birth but they grew up in a Christian home?
It can. Now, what I have found is there's a lot of complex trauma in Christian homes. And I would say almost just as much as in others, because there's a lot of sick Christians. And so I have to be really careful on navigating that, because most of the clients that I deal with on any given day have been wounded by Christians. Either a distorted view of God, either kind of a Hitler father, it's my way or the highway, I'll tell you what to think, don't you think for yourself. And that's their environment. And so if they got into a Christian home where that spiritual need, they're introduced to God's love for them, and the parents modeled that, yes, that can make a huge difference. And I find for most people who are adopted, so go back to these arrows, the greater the complex trauma, people in the lower end of complex trauma who become addicts, they don't need God to get straight. They just need some self-awareness and growth. But the greater the complex trauma gets, the more they need God. They can't get out of this on their own. And so the most severe, until they kind of come to that spiritual piece and really take it in, they just don't get beyond a certain point. But it's tricky because you don't want to take people there before they're ready, because many are very resistant to that because of the damage that they've done.
Has there been any work or knowledge in the sense of what happens in a baby even before they're born?
Yes, there is.
And because, I worked with somebody through a whole prayer, thing. We went down,
Yep.
age,
In
got
the
to well in the womb and just wrote
Yep.
for like 3 hours of
Yep.
unbelievable weeping
Yep.
that I couldn't believe. And that was at that
So the
point.
whole, just to let you understand, kind of 10 years now with complex trauma being researched. Trauma, it started as, and then brain imaging, so we can see what's happening in brains. It's just been opening up all of these new things. So infants and in the womb, if the mother's under a lot of stress, we know it does affect the baby.
This person was adopted
Yeah.
as well, right?
Exactly.
So the whole emotion,
Yeah.
she just could, somehow was aware deep down
Yeah.
of her mother's emotion
Exactly.
of not wanting her
Yeah.
while she's in
Exactly.
the womb.
So let me say this in connection to that. What we have here is attachment. So what I teach clients is this. We were made to attach. So if there's no attachment to a parent, that emotional, strong attachment where I feel totally loved, totally safe, then I have complex trauma. So complex trauma is the lack of attachment. Because I don't have a rock, I don't have a safe refuge, I don't have any of those things, I'm all by myself. So abuse is lack of attachment, and needs not met is lack of attachment. A busy dad is a child wants to attach to dad, but dad's too busy to attach back. Abandonment is nobody wants to attach with me, that says the loudest statement about who I must be. And so all of that is attachment stuff. And that's where, for a lot of people, when they finally can attach to God, some real healing can happen. But again, there's a lot of obstacles to be overcome to ever get there. But it's all tied into the attachment stuff. But I think it's, more and more we're going to have clients who start getting flashbacks and memories from very, very early, before even you would think a person would have a memory. And I think God can do that to just help them become aware of some of the deepest wounds. And I think what I have to do with clients, because when I'm teaching this, they're hearing their own history growing up, but they're also thinking about what they put their kids through. And they can go to a really dark place in a hurry when they start to realize, I've done this to my kids, and then beat themselves up and get really down. And so you have to kind of watch for that and stop them and say, hey, if your kids are still with you, you can turn this around. There is hope. It's going to take a lot of work. But it starts with becoming a safe person so your child can attach. And that's really what you got to focus on right now, is not fixing them, fixing you, and that in turn will end up fixing them. Questions? You need a little break? Then we'll get into the brain.
There you go. Little beginner. Oh, see.
I've gone into it for like 15 minutes and I thought to myself, maybe we should all go home now. And then you said, you're just getting started.
That's still going?
So just a quick question. How many felt some stuff getting stirred up in that 45 minutes? Okay. So here's part of my challenge as far as staffing a React. So it's fairly easy to teach phase 1. It's just some academic information. Phase 2, if I put a person teaching phase 2 with a chance they're going to get triggered by what people are sharing or what they're teaching, and then that could put them into fight-flight, that could be a dangerous situation. So teaching phase 2, you just have to be more aware of just how vulnerable you are and in what areas, because you can get triggered and get right blindsided. We have a young woman, well, she's 33, but she was triggered. She's really developed well, healed with a whole bunch of stuff, and is a great teacher. And one day she got teaching and something triggered her and she just had a meltdown. And so that kind of thing can happen. Okay, one of the things that I'm always looking for ways that help people understand complex trauma from a little different angle, okay? So I like to, once in a while, throw in a little Greek lesson for them. So I say in the Greek language, they have 2 words for life. Bios, from which we get biology, and Zoe, which lots of girls are named, and dogs and cats. Bios is biological life. Your physical body works, your heartbeat, your lungs work. But the Greeks realized that you could have a person who's physically alive but is dead in their soul. So they understand that right away. So what complex trauma does is it keeps you with bios life only. You're dead in your soul. So you look into the eyes and there's no life there. It's shut down, it's dark, it's empty. And so we actually had a guy this past week that we got talking about this, and this guy is 45, and he has been in gangs, he's been on the street, he's been a male prostitute, and he started crying because he says, I don't have any Zoe, and I want Zoe, but I'm afraid to get it, is what he said. Because to do that, I got to stop doing the things that keep me safe, which keep me stuck in bios. So Zoe is what the Greeks recognize, that's real life. That's when you are able to relate, have joy, positive emotions, have peace and serenity. And so what many will realize is all their emotions have been negative, and that's why they shut down. They don't know what a positive emotion is, and they don't know what any peace or serenity is. So that in some ways helps them realize, okay, complex trauma has cut me off from a more fulfilling life. And they see that, and for some that can just say, okay, I want this. And it gives them that extra little bit of motivation. Okay, next thing, this is my rudimentary drawing of a brain. So what I do, you can do this in all kinds of ways. Some days this takes up the whole morning. They get totally fascinated by it. You did some of the brain and the memory stuff and the burning of the bridge with cortisol. So there's the brain stem. So that develops first in the womb. That regulates all your organs, all your subconscious stuff, your breathing, your heartbeat, your blood pressure. Everything's controlled by your brainstem. If your brainstem dies, you're dead. Okay? Then you get the limbic. That develops next, and so we refer to it as the child brain. And it's mainly 2 things that are important with the child brain, is you just got to put yourself in the child, okay? And think like a child. So a couple things, it makes decisions based on emotions. So I don't feel like going to school today, so I shouldn't have to go to school today. I don't feel like doing my chores, so I shouldn't have to do my chores. So the wisdom of a decision is totally based on your emotions, how I'm feeling. And then secondly, it's based on short-term thinking. And the short-term thinking is, will this give me instant pleasure or keep me safe instantly? So a decision is wise based on, does it keep me safe or give me pleasure? So you give a child the choice, do you want to eat your broccoli or have a chocolate bar? That's a no-brainer for a kid. I want a chocolate bar because it gives me instant pleasure. They aren't able to think long-term in terms of long-term consequences. That's why they need parents. That's why they hate parents till they get to be an adult themselves and they think their parents got really smart all of a sudden because they begin to realize the parents were working out of their cerebral cortex. And that was God's design. That's the last part that develops. It sits in judgment on everything else. It's the thinking, processing, evaluating part of the brain. It used to be believed that your cortex finished developing around 25. Now what they're saying, they're believing is it's still developing long into your 30s. So it continues to grow and develop. Now, so this is based on what is right or healthy, not on emotions, and long-term thinking. So what are the long-term consequences of this decision? I want to think that out. I don't care whether it gives me instant pleasure. I want to care, is it healthy? And if it's healthy, then in long-term it'll bring positive results. Okay? So what you need to understand is what part of the brain does complex trauma trigger? Your limbic. So that's your fear center. That's your anger center. Where does a complex trauma person get stuck? So they think like a child. They don't grow up. Okay, now there's an extra trick here. So if your limbic becomes overdeveloped, what it does is it basically divides your cortex in half. Now, not literally, I'm just saying this metaphorically. It has a part of your thinking that's all distorted. And so you think you're thinking clearly, but you're thinking distorted. So you're using your cortex, but it's guided by your emotions. So you go, somebody set a boundary with me, it feels like they're rejecting me, so they must be rejecting me. Really, they set a boundary to make a healthier relationship. But you have distorted thinking based on how you're feeling. Does that make sense to you? Okay? And then there's the accurate or truth part, which rarely gets used. Okay? And so what they have to understand is you're fighting in healing from complex trauma, you're fighting a very powerful, overdeveloped limbic system, and there's part of you that is still acting as a child. And so most of them I'll say, how old do you feel? What, as far as decision making and coping and handling situations, most will say 6 to 12 years old. So they really recognize they still operate out of the limbic and they still think like a child. And so that's why we talk about their emotional age versus their belly button age, because they get all of that. And so what you're doing is saying we're rewiring the brain. That's really what this healing journey is. But you've got major opposition in doing it. So if you go back to the circle, to complex trauma, and this has always been danger and pain. So the child thinks danger, fight, flight, free, instant safety. Okay? So now they go, I'm going to operate out of my cortex. I checked out this person and this situation, it is safe. So I'm going to take a risk of going through this new behavior. And I go, how do you feel when you're that far into it? This is the worst idea in the world. Because your limbic brain is in fear mode. Because this is a new behavior. And before everything in your life is said, pain never, ever once has led to anything good. It always leads to more pain. So you're telling me now to change that formula, that equation, and say pain might be doable and lead to something good? But they might believe it, but as soon as they get into it, all that unknown and all of that fear comes up, and everything in, I can't do this, I'm out of here. So what they need to realize, and they realize powerfully, is to fight the limbic system is a massive challenge. Because it is very, very powerful, and you have developed thousands and thousands of brain circuits that have been triggered by your limbic system that all take you into unhealthy patterns. So thoughts, emotions, actions, so they're all triggered by your limbic. Okay, follow that? And then you've got all your distortions. So I'm fat. Nobody would want to be with me. All of your shame distortions, all of your fear distortions. I can't try something new, I can't talk on the phone, I can't do that because I might not know what to say and I might look stupid. And so all of those things, you're fighting lie after lie after lie that has been programmed for years, and then you're trying to see things in a healthy way. So you're fighting limbic, you're fighting distortions, and both of those are super powerful. So when they realize that really it's retraining your brain to move out of being a child to an adult, they go, okay, I get that. And there's no magic formula or magic pill to make that happen. You're just basically gradually rewiring new circuits that when I get the fear trigger, instead of going down the old circuit, I'm going to go on this new circuit. Okay? Now there's one piece with that. So we know that a child has zero skill to handle stress or problems. Every ability a child has to handle stress, which means handling problems, they learn. And all of their emotional world, they basically mirror their mother, first of all, and her emotional state they pick up, okay? So, for a child, if they're in a healthy home, they have to learn to tie their shoes. It's frustrating, but they're encouraged, they're helped. They learn to walk, they learn to ride their bike, they go to school, they handle problem after problem. And as they gain more tools, they're able to handle more stress. Follow? Okay? What happens in complex trauma is you get some tools, but at some point, that became your way of coping. So why learn new tools when now I got the perfect tool? So you thought, okay? So what happens in recovery is you're now going to learn new tools. And that you're going to learn in the classroom, and then you're going to go out there and get the exam and learn and apply them, etc. And it's going to feel scary and all of those things. And you're going to gradually learn new tools. Okay. What the brain research has shown is this. So let's say they get up to here, but all of a sudden they get a problem that is out of their tool kit capability. What we know is at that point, the brain says go back to the oldest system, it's the most reliable. And so that's where a person will go back to fight, flight, freeze. So you can have a person that's been clean for 5 years, 10 years, they've been learning tools, and all of a sudden, partner dies, they lose their job, they lose their house, they lose all of their stuff, too much stress, back. So the brain tolerates a certain amount of stress as long as I'm learning tools, but if it gets too much, it reverts to the oldest. So that's important for them to realize as well, because this is never totally solved, is what I want them to see. It can still mess you up down the road if you're not continually learning and growing. Okay, questions on that?
When that happens, you just have to wait for them to come back or whatever, like so they've triggered and gone into using again.
Exactly.
Then it's just a matter of up to them to decide.
Yeah. So hopefully, if they've already found a nurturing family, they'll come back more quickly because they know it's safe and they'll be welcome. But some still have to go for a while. Yeah. Did you do the 5 parts of healing from complex trauma? So you need an education piece, the self-awareness, the skills, academic. Then you need a therapy piece, the healing the wounds, the cries, all of the cathartic stuff. Then you need to have a support network. So I like to tell the story. Have you heard the Johan Hari? Have you heard his name? You have? Okay. So he put out about 2 years ago research that's just been done around rats. So it used to be that rats, the research was they trained them to push levers, water, food, etc. And then once they found the drugs, they pushed those levers till they dropped over dead.
Oh, the Rat Park one?
Right.
Yeah, we heard that.
Okay, so the rat part. Okay, so that's that support network. You need a surrogate family. And that's the attachment piece. You got to start reconnecting and finding safe people, safety, so you're not living in complex trauma survival mode. So they get that, and that's so important. And then number 4 is you begin to get some healthy, intimate relationships. Not necessarily romantic, but your deepest issues you were wounded by your most intimate relationships, so now your deepest healing comes by your most intimate relationships. And so that's the most treacherous part for most because it triggers deep, deep stuff. And then number 5 is you got to learn to handle the triggers. What do you do when you get escalated? How do you de-escalate? How do you not go back to here? How do you get out of your limbic back to here? So when your limbic is fired up, you get cortisol. And when cortisol fires up, it intentionally shuts down your cortex. Because it basically says, we don't have time to think right now, we got to act. We got to survive. So cortisol has the effect of shutting down your thinking. And so that's why it's useless to talk with a borderline personality person when they're triggered. Because they're not rational. You can't reason with them because that's all shut down. You got to wait till they de-escalate before you can have a conversation. And so that becomes a very important thing. So you'll get many addicts who they get into a fear situation and are triggered, and it's like they forgot everything they learned in recovery so far. It just, my memory went. I didn't have one tool in my toolkit, and they feel like down on themselves, like I haven't learned anything. What was the purpose of all this? And I go, no, you learned, it was just you were triggered. Once you get to learn to de-escalate, all of that memory stuff will come back and you'll remember the tool. So in that moment when you're triggered, don't do anything crazy. Just work at de-escalating and getting your cortex back online. That becomes the first real skill tool that they need to learn as far as handling the triggers in the here and now. So every addict does really well when everything's going well. It's when things aren't and they're triggered, number 1. Or it's the child brain that says, this is getting boring, this is too hard, I need some action, and they don't think long term anymore, they just want instant stuff. So the child brain is what keeps them in the, make this more fun or I'm out of here. Okay, any questions on all that?
I didn't get the all 5. Or what was the last one you said? It was, they work on
Handling
shutting-
triggers.
Just called handling trigger.
Yeah. So one of the things, Purposely React did a day program, an outpatient program, because I worked in a residential facility for 13 years, and it's a protective bubble. And so you need a bit of that in the early days. But what would happen, a person would go through 8 weeks or so of residential care, and they learn all this stuff, they think it's great, then they go out of their protective bubble, back to real life, and they all relapse because they all got triggered, and they didn't know what to do. And so part of what React was for is I want people learning, but living partly in that real world, so they can come back and say, well, did I ever get triggered last night? Okay, let's learn from that. And let's process what's going on here. And learn your patterns and what are the new tools that you could learn. Okay, anything else? Some of you are looking exhausted already. Okay, we will keep going. One of the things that I find helpful for clients, and this can take a whole morning as well, but you guys have covered the brain chemicals of cortisol and oxytocin, right?
Yes.
So oxytocin is what I call the fourth F. So you take your Christian hat off and put on your secular hat, and it's the F-U-C-K one. It makes you want to go get in a relationship to keep you safe, or somebody to love you, okay? So that's danger. Oxytocin says run to mommy for a hug, and oxytocin mommy says run and hug your child and protect them. If they've not had that, now one of the things you'll find with a lot of clients is they have shut their oxytocin system down so much, trying not to care, because what they realized early on is if you don't care about anything, it doesn't hurt as much if you lose it. So shut her down, and then they have kids and they just have no feelings for it. They don't feel any desire to connect, and that's really guilt-ridden for them to experience that. And so part of it too is they might have had a mother that just had no physical affection for them. So that oxytocin thing is a big issue. And so when an oxytocin system has been shut down and not allowed to function, you can continue to live struggling with it shut down, struggling to connect, or you can go to the other extreme and connect with the first thing that feels like love. Then you're running to every woman or guy that comes along that looks like they're going to love you. And so that's some of the challenges there. And then you looked at dopamine, which is the pleasure stuff. So your drugs, alcohol, all affect the dopamine system. And it's your pleasure. And so you get your anhedonia in the first 3 months where you don't feel pleasure as your brain is healing. Then there's the serotonin network, and that's your attachment drug. Oxytocin and serotonin are your relationship stuff. It's what makes you feel part of. It makes you feel you belong. It makes you feel good because you're socially, relationally good. And so lack of serotonin is depression, but lack of serotonin is also I don't want people. Can't deal with people. Don't want people around me. So serotonin is affected. And then your endorphin system, which is your exercise drug. So if you look at oxytocin and endorphins, they have a unique thing. Both of them kill pain. They're medicators. So if you're a woman's in labor, large doses of oxytocin help her with the pain of labor. Endorphins, when you're running and exerting yourself, endorphins cause the pain to get numb. So they have kind of that pain numbing thing, but they're also pleasure things. Okay? They give you the good feelings as well. And so the person that's exercising, afterwards they're pumped up, they're in a better frame of mind. So what I do with clients sometimes is take them through the brain chemicals in light of complex trauma. Okay? So cortisol, complex trauma, all the time. Cortisol was designed to be short bursts only, rarely. Extreme danger. And it is always a negative chemical. It always leads to anger. It always leads to fear. It's all about negative. Okay? Oxytocin was designed to be intimate relationships and love. Complex trauma, not there. Okay? Dopamine, all your emotions are basically negative. Pain, embarrassment, fear, shame. So there's not much pleasure, not much dopamine happening, not much social connection, and endorphins if you work out. But complex trauma basically takes all your brain chemicals and misaligns them. You see that? So part of what they realize is they've got a system that has been messed up as far as their brain chemistry. And so they're fighting and working against that as well. So you can see as people are for the first time in recovery, just what I've done in the last hour and a half, they could go, I'm screwed. This is just too big of an uphill journey. And it can feel very overwhelming. Now, some people who've been there for a while, they're your best allies at this point in time, because they'll say to the other clients who are brand new, hang in there, it gets better. In a couple weeks, you'll be feeling a lot of positive emotions. Right now, it just feels like it's way too much. But what I say to people is this. If you read the Bible, 1 John 1:9, if we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us. That word confess in Greek means to say the same thing as God does. And what that basically means, God sees everything 100% accurately. He doesn't deny, minimize, rationalize, justify. So if I'm going to heal, I got to get 100% honest and 100% aware. So the greater the awareness, the greater the chance for healing. And that becomes, they get that because they've seen the power of secrets. They've seen the power of all of that sick stuff they've hid from others. And the joy when they finally get it out in the light. So what I want people to understand is they're still going to be running out of their limbic system. Okay, so what I take them to next is what is their default setting. Did you cover default setting? Okay. So default setting, once they understand it, they get it right away. So I ask clients this, if you weren't going to meetings, if you didn't do your meditation and prayer and devotions in the morning, if you just went back to your old kind of busy, distracted lifestyle, where would you end up emotionally, spiritually, mentally? That's your default setting. That's where you naturally gravitate to if you're not working on yourself. And for complex trauma, it's always a negative place. So if I ask people, what is your default setting? They will say, if I'm not working on myself, I go to anger. I just am angry all the time. Or I go to shame, I just am overwhelmed with shame, or fear, anxiety. And I often will spend a part of a morning putting onto the board people's default settings. So they begin to realize, where do I go in my thinking, in my emotions, in my behaviors when I'm not growing and working on myself. So what you see here is the default setting is mixed up. It's backwards from the way God designed it. And so what you're fighting with in recovery is that if you stop working on yourself, you don't gravitate to a better place, you gravitate to a worse place. And so you can't just coast for a while and not be aware or alert, because there's a gravitational pull on you that's all negative. Okay? Then the next thing that I want people to see is God designed the limbic system so that the limbic system, that emotions create a pull on us as to how we act. So if you're depressed, what is the pull of depression? I want to isolate. I'm negative. I don't want to do anything. So the pull of a negative emotion is always self-destructive. It is always to a negative behavior, to a negative thinking. If I'm anxious, filled with anxiety, what is the pull? It's a powerful pull, is what I want people to realize. I want to isolate. I want to procrastinate. I want to avoid. I want to numb. I don't want to do anything, so it pulls me to a very dangerous place. If I'm angry, so I go through the most powerful negative emotions. Where does anger take you? I just want to kill somebody. I just want to scream. I want to disrespect everybody. Pull is downward. Pull is very negative. So when they get triggered, it's usually negative emotions that get triggered. And what they realize is in the intensity of that trigger, because some triggers are more intense than others, is the pull in a nanosecond can be, I'm having a great day, I want to do something really bad. That's how powerful that pull can be to the old stuff. So that default setting is important, because many people, what we'll do in the Emotions Week is to get clients to do an emotional inventory every morning. So what emotions am I feeling today, right now? And once they begin to get a sense of how to do that, then they begin to look for, am I falling into my default setting? Because if I am, I'm in danger. So I need to be aware of that, because the more I'm aware of my default setting, the more I can spot when I'm sliding into it. And most will realize once they're in their default setting for a certain length of time, they cross a line of no return. There's no coming back now. They're down and they're going into the old behaviors full bore. And so it's the earlier you can catch the early warning signs of going into your default setting, the better. Okay? All good? Okay, so I'm just wondering whether you want a quick break or we'll just keep rolling here for a little bit. Okay, quick washroom break. I got one more thing I want to try to get through. You to be giving a little bit of thought to what I'd like to do tomorrow is to do what I mentioned at the beginning around your top 5 issues. And so to have you raise 1 or 2 issues that others would struggle with as well. And then we'll just kind of, I'll take you through what we would do in response to that. And what you're going to find with that is you can go so deep with people when they get into what their issues are. It's just often a beautiful thing to watch happen in the room as people start to get light bulbs going off and relief and release and tools and all of that. Okay, this is something that I came up with a couple of years ago just as one way to help complex trauma people understand themselves. So it's a bit of a, makes you sound like you're crazy, but I call it the 5 people inside of me. And so what it means is this: within every person in treatment, there's the addict you. So what I say to people is when you are in active addiction, or when you're in addictive behaviors, addictive thinking, you might not have picked up yet, but you're back thinking and acting like an addict. What are you like? And what they realize is a different me comes out. So it's not like I am in recovery. It's very different from that person. But that person is part of my brain. That person is a whole bunch of brain circuits that when they get permission to operate, they take over and this other person comes out. Everybody following the metaphor here? And so you go into the thoughts. So they quickly go. So Ron, what are some thoughts that an addict goes when they're in active addiction? What goes on in the brain?
Oh, I gotta relieve the emotional pain that I'm in.
Exactly. Then I gotta deal with the guilt that I feel for relieving the emotional pain. Then I gotta think about how to get the drug, how to lie about using the drug, how to recover from the drug. But it's all about me. Everything is about getting, how do I get, how do I hide, how do I protect? And so you get a very self-centered and a very funnel-like thinking. Because it's very, very small little world you put yourself into, okay? And then what are the emotions that the addict is going through? So you got all kinds of pain, all kinds of guilt. You're just agitated, you're antsy, nothing's fast enough, you can't wait for anything. So your whole emotional world is all negative while you chase a positive emotion.
Right.
So you're chasing one positive emotion, pleasure, but you're getting more pain in the process. And then your actions, it's all about me, and so you're selfish, you're self-centered, you're lashing out, you don't care who you hurt, you're hurting people, you're not acting in a loving way at all. So everything in your behavior violates love. You lie, cheat, steal, whatever you got to do to get the drug. Okay? So everybody knows that person is there. And if they were to relapse, within a minute they would be back. This person would be in control and operating. Okay? So that's number 1. And then the second one is you have the mental health you. So you might be going along feeling great and all of a sudden you feel anxiety through the roof. And what they realize is a different person comes out. When anxiety takes over, I no longer want to be social. I no longer want to deal with anything. I no longer want to be responsible. I no longer want to socialize. I just go to this very different person. And so you walk through, what does the mental health use? So then they can go anxiety, then you go depression, bipolar. That adds a dimension that makes it very different. And so they begin to realize all the thoughts, all of the emotions and actions that came out of addict were negative. All the ones that come out of mental health, negative. Follow? Okay? Then you have the person that comes out when your trauma is triggered. So if your trauma gets triggered very quickly, what thoughts start running through your head that weren't there 5 minutes ago? Find safety. Self-protection becomes the theme. And so it becomes all about you. You become just like the addict. The addict's all about me in terms of pleasure. Traumatized is all about me in terms of safety. But that's who comes out, and so your thoughts are, how do I protect myself? I will lie, I will cheat, I will steal, but I have to protect myself. I become irrational in my thinking. When the traumatized you comes out, the addict you, the mental health, you become obsessive in your thinking. Your brain just spins and spins and spins with no solutions. So you walk through all of the things that happen, and what they find out again is the traumatized, negative, negative, negative. Okay? And then you have, and this one's connected to the traumatized with the child. So most will quickly identify that there's still an inner child. There's a part of them that is deep down, buried inside, locked away in a closet, that was never allowed to grow up. And that's the little boy or the little girl. And most immediately can connect with that internally. And so when you go through the thoughts of that traumatized child, so I get them to go back to, if they went to visit their mom, let's say for Thanksgiving, and mom just said, I'm ashamed of you. And all of a sudden they feel like a 5-year-old again. And so they quickly connect with that, and I go, okay, what kind of thoughts then go through your head? And they get all small, they feel powerless, they feel like they're a burden to everybody, it's all their fault, and they go into all of these very distorted thinking patterns, and then all painful, negative emotions, hopeless, shame, fear, anger, and then they self-protect actions, or they curl up in a ball, they fight, flight, freeze. So you see, negative, 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 okay? So guess what recovery is? The adult you. So this here, that's your limbic brain. There's your cortex. So then I say, of the 5, which one's the weakest inside of you? For most, the adult's the weakest. Does that make sense to you? So the addict is still an everyday struggle. It's quite powerful. It's a monster they got locked up, but man, it starts roaring and gets hungry. And then you got the mental health you, that it's an up and down thing, and it can come and hit you, and then when it takes over, it is awful. If your trauma gets triggered, or that little child, that is just, it's a powerful force. It's like a monster comes out. And this one, it can just be knocked down in no time. So what I want them again to realize from that is that this is usually the weakest, and so the goal of recovery is to make the adult the strongest. So right now, if any of these take over, they trump the adult. The goal is that the adult trumps everything else. But they begin to realize, wow, I understand how difficult it is to deal with these 4, because I deal with it every day. And I can get triggered and blindsided by triggers that I didn't see coming, and it can put me in a terrible place. So I got to keep focusing on developing this adult in me. Okay? Questions on that? So do you see how each one of those illustrations just added an extra little perspective, insight? for people to get a clear picture of what complex trauma has done to their internal workings. Okay? One other thing I want to do, and then we'll be done. So you have a Christian audience, you have the wide road and the narrow road, okay? Narrow road leads to life, wide road leads to destruction, okay? So here's the narrow road, which I call healthy living by God's design, okay? On each side, there's a boundary. So I can take food and I can use food within a healthy, but on a bad day when I just want to medicate my emotions, I can step across the boundary and use food in an unhealthy way. Follow that? Okay? So that is that everything in life, every gift, every pleasurable thing, we can use it in a healthy way or we can use it in an unhealthy, and there's a boundary that measures when we cross into the unhealthy. Okay? So sometimes, so then what I do with clients is this. What are the things that cause me to go into the unhealthy? Okay? So that's where you get your default setting. So unhealthy is normal. That feels normal. That feels the usual. Healthy, that feels restrictive. Now you got to live by certain rules. You got to do things every day, whether you feel like it or not. And this feels very confining. But if I go outside, I think I'm finding freedom, but I end up finding slavery again. So that they get that, okay? So your default setting is you're fighting against it. What I then talk about, you familiar with the siren song story? So the siren song is a Greek myth. So the siren were beautiful, beautiful women that sang in a beautiful, beautiful voice, and they sang this song that was so enticing and compelling that soldiers sailing on the Mediterranean couldn't resist the pull. And they all crashed on the rocks. And so year after year, sailors had trouble sailing through the Mediterranean because they'd hear the siren song and it was so alluring they would crash. And so they began to realize, well, we got to stop this. How do we stop the power of the siren song? And that's, every addict feels that. So they will feel the siren song of the drugs that constantly pulls, but they also feel it in terms of the lifestyle. And for some people, crime, the criminal lifestyle, or the party lifestyle, the high is so powerful, it just keeps pulling them. And so what soldiers did is they tried all kinds of different things to stop crashing on the rocks, until one day, one sailor said, I'm going to write a more beautiful song. And then once we get near the islands, it will play the more beautiful song, and it'll overpower the siren song. And so they get that, because then I go, okay, what's your more beautiful song? Because if you don't get a more beautiful song, you're still going to hear that siren song. And they get that because they know the power of that siren song. And so for many, you can go in a spiritual direction. For others, it's just finding things that are healthy pleasures. What gives you a healthy pleasure? And then the next thing is temptation. So I love to draw. No, I don't love to draw, but I love to draw this. So the Greek word for temptation is a worm on the hook. And so what it is it promises us a great meal, but it captures us and imprisons us. So it lies to us. So every temptation, there's a lie inside of it that promises pleasure, but delivers captivity. And so those enticements will come along. And so every person, so a bass would be attracted to one kind of lure, a salmon would be attracted to a very different lure. So everybody's going to have their own unique temptations that are their vulnerable points. And so they need to understand what's that worm on the hook that I'm most vulnerable to. Because if I don't learn to identify the lies of that, every time I see that worm, I'm going to bite down. Because I'm thinking in limbic, I want short-term pleasure. And I don't care about long-term captivity. So they need to begin to understand that. And then, okay, I got to replace lies with the truth. And I have to build in safety nets, safeguards, about being exposed to that temptation, because I'm just not strong enough to handle it. And so what, again, you're wanting them to see is dealing with complex trauma is you're learning to walk within boundaries. You're learning to live within a set of rules that are healthy. And what I tell people is, complex trauma has taught you that rules are made by authority figures that don't have your best in mind. It's only to get what they want, so rules are bad. So we rebel. Rules are actually designed by God to define love. They're designed to bring blessing. They're designed to make life rich. But a limbic brain doesn't like restrictions. And so we're training our brain and ourselves to live within the boundaries of healthy, knowing that we're constantly going to be pulled to go outside of that boundary. And that will come day after day. You might have breaks from it where the cravings are gone or the obsession is gone, but it can come back. It just takes the right thing to trigger it, and then the pull to go outside of that is all there again. Okay, any questions? I covered with you tonight what it'd probably take a week with clients, because they would just have a million questions in there. So any final questions?
I do have a question. For the 5 people inside, can you go over the mental health, like what kind of thoughts, emotions, and actions?
So what I find with the mental health is the anxiety and depression are the ones they quickly get, because most addicts struggle with the anxiety and depression. 90% of addicts have depression and anxiety. So I go, when let's say you're feeling great, and then all of a sudden the depression hits you, what happens inside you? So most of them immediately go, I just want to sleep all the time. I don't want to go out socially. I want to isolate. I can't bring myself to get motivated to do anything. And then I go into, I don't like my life, life sucks, there's no solution, very defeatist type thinking. I can just spin in my brain like a hamster on a wheel, wondering what am I going to do, what are people thinking, all of that. So my thought life can just be torturous, and it can keep me awake at night and no way of turning it off. And then what I want them to realize is with depression, though it's the predominant emotion, there's other emotions. So with depression, usually there's this hopelessness that starts to settle in, and a helplessness. I just feel powerless to change my circumstances, my feelings. Some become very irritable all the time. All of their emotional energy's been used up by the depression, so everything irritates them. And they just have no patience, they're snappy with everybody. Some go to very negative feelings and thinking, find fault with everything sucks, nothing's any good. And then they isolate, then they can go to self-harm behaviors, then they can just eat or watch movies every day, all day, those kind of things. All attempts to try to medicate it, to try to cope, to try to feel a little better.
Is that where suicidality would be, the actions like suicide? Yeah.
So we're going to look at with the emotions, but what I want clients to understand is our thoughts affect how we feel, but our feelings affect how we think. So they feed each other. And so with depression, if you give into the pull of isolating, I don't want to socialize, it gives you instant, I feel a little better, but you're going to feel worse tomorrow because you've not dealt with it properly. So by isolating the action, you actually make your emotions worse, which makes your thinking worse. And so the very thing that it pulls you towards, which gives you instant relief, ends up making things worse. And so you're fighting against the pull that is very powerful in a negative direction and doing the exact thing you don't want to do. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you everybody. See you tomorrow. Oh, like earlier?
Yeah, we got like half an
Oh,
hour.
I thought it was 6 o'clock.
6:30.
Ron's ready to go. Okay. I was thinking.
Good, keep going.
We got it. Okay, any other
I
questions
have a
then?
question. With the cortisol that's released in the limbic part of the brain, that can be tested on blood work.
Yeah.
Do addicts do possibly get blood work to see what the cortisol levels are, to see?
They can, like through your adrenal stuff.
Cortisol in the
Let me
system?
say a couple things around that, okay? When I do default setting, what I get people to think about is this. I go, how many of you are addicted to anger? And what they realize is they're actually addicted to cortisol. So they need cortisol to give them energy in the morning, and they need anger to help them get that energy. They need cortisol in order to kind of give them the courage to do stuff. And so their brain is, without realizing, addicted to cortisol, which comes out as anger. But then I go, how many of you are, and they got to think about this next one, how many of you are addicted to fear? And they go, But then they start thinking about it and they realize they are addicted to fear. So their brain is actually creating fear scenarios to feed the fear. And then how many of you are addicted to guilt? And most are addicted to guilt. And so they will always find a way to say, I failed, in order to beat themselves up. So they got to feed the guilt monster. And then anxiety. Many are addicted to anxiety. Oxytocin, many addicted to that. So then with that, what I do next is, okay, when you have used drugs, you have a hangover the next day, or you crash. How many of you understand an adrenaline crash or a cortisol crash? And they all do. I go, how many of you understand an anger hangover? And they do. Because it's like you just, all your energy's gone, your brain's fuzzy, you're not sharp. And so when we start becoming your default setting with the wrong chemicals in the brain, you set yourself up to become addicted to very harmful things. So one of the things that's really fascinating to me, there's a lady out of Australia, a Christian lady, who does brain research, Carolyn Leaf, yes. So the brain, basically when you look at the brain chemicals, the brain was designed for joy. All the negative emotions were just to be blips on the screen and quickly resolve so you go back to joy. So the brain was not made for pain. It hates pain, it can't stand pain. As soon as it has pain, it's looking for a solution. So complex trauma takes a brain that's designed for joy and zero pain, and it gives it constant pain with zero joy. So it does a complete flip on the design. And so your brain then has to totally rewire itself to survive and become something that it was never designed to be. Another thing that they're finding is this. So your brain has natural circuits. So you can think of it in terms of, if you learn, let's say you were raised French and you spoke French for a while, and then you moved to a different country and never spoke French for 20 years, and then you went back to Quebec, you wouldn't be remembering. And so what the brain does is it's constantly monitoring which circuits are being used the most, and it can only stand so many being used, and anything else that's not being used very much, it just starts cutting out. So it's conserving its energy for the main circuits. So complex trauma, what you're doing is making all your main circuits negative. So you're cutting out love, you're cutting out relating, you're cutting out trust, you're cutting out pleasure, because you don't got time for that stuff. You gotta survive. So your brain is being forced to get rid of the very circuits that it was designed to have to give it life. Very good question.
Have you seen in your work a difference in ages and how it reacts to this kind of treatment in the protocol? Like a younger, because you know when you're talking about adult brain and the cortex developing, and I'm just curious, let's say you had a younger person, a 17, 18-year-old on the street, an addict, versus a 50-year-old.
Right, okay, so there's two parts to that.
Okay.
So the first thing that I say is, the earlier you started using fight-flight as your main coping skill, the longer it's going to take you to learn healthy. Because if you started at 3 or 5 by escaping into fantasy, by checking out, or by running away or whatever, you've set in a system that you've reinforced for way longer than a person that started at 20. So the healing time will be, and the rewiring of the brain will take longer. So it's really kind of when your main way of coping, fight, flight, what age you're at, determines kind of the uphill battle. Now the trick, or the piece that is really important is when you bring addiction into it. Because what happens in addiction is you're purposely living in a world of complex trauma. You're living in a world of danger. And so the longer you stay in addiction, it's like you had great complex trauma because you've created it now. So you can have a person came from a fairly decent home and a person came from severe abuse, and they both end up addicts. And in 10 years, they're both in the same way of behaving, thinking, because they've just gone there in their addiction into severe complex trauma. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
So, in a sense, every addict, regardless of their upbringing, has created their own complex trauma, which they now have to deal with. But people that grew up without the addiction within complex trauma, there's that element of how young they were when they started Fight, Flight, Freeze.
There's no drugs.
So you'll get clients that want to know why they haven't developed the dopamine pill and all of that to just magically fix. So part of, to me, what is really an uphill climb as far as being a teacher of complex trauma is we all look for a magic fix, right? That we're wired that way. And sadly, there's a lot of Christian churches that advertise magic pills. And you'll get addicts chasing those, and I get criticized because I say, there's no magic pill, this is the work and there's a lot of it. And if you're not committed to change at every level, you're in for a long, long journey. And so people don't like such an honest look, but I go, there's no other way of healing and changing. Okay, so let me give you one other piece with this. And just again, I'm trying to give you a big, big picture view right up front. Are any of you familiar with TMC? I can't remember what it stands for. Trans something model of change. Okay, I'll explain it to you because it's really important with complex trauma. So what it basically says is this. A person is going along in life at a status quo, and it's easy to get stuck there and figure, this is my life, it is good. So what we need in order to change is we need a massive interruption of pain. So that can go from an addict who needs to hit a bottom before they're willing to change, or it can go from somebody who says, I'm fixed, I don't have any problems, go work your complex trauma on somebody else, I don't want to look at it. And they're not going to look at it until they get a massive amount of pain. So what I tell people is, in my mind, addiction for people from complex trauma is one of God's blessings in the sense that it forces them to look at the stuff that has to change. Nobody likes it, but they're blessed in the end because they realize there's thousands of people in our culture that live in $1 million homes and they look like they got their act together, but they're dying inside, no Zoe life, and they're never going to have the pain that pushes them to look honestly at themselves, okay? So what happens then once you change, or hit the point, is you change and you immediately feel positive benefits. So the line goes up, okay? But then something happens. This is all new territory. You've never been here before. So this now is the unknown, and we don't like the unknown. And so we start to have, am I doing it right? Maybe I'm not, self-doubt. Is this person really telling me the truth? How do I know for sure? So you get that, and then you get opposition. You get family that says, we like the way you used to be. Now they're the ones that wanted you to change, and now that you're changing, they don't like the change. And so now all the people that used to be supporting you are now saying, we don't like the way you are anymore. It's like you don't need us, you think you're better than us, blah, blah, blah. And so now you're getting opposition, and some of your friends don't want to hang around with you anymore. And so that's working on you. Okay, anything else you can think that begins to happen once you start changing?
All the family dynamics and the dynamics within your family group.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So now you go to family and you're the only one that's wanting to live by different rules, and you're exposing the dynamics, and they don't like that, so they're opposed to that. And then there's what I call new level equals new devil. So you thought your only problem was addiction. Then you started to change and you realized, oh no, I got complex trauma. Started dealing with that, oh no, I got abandonment issues. Oh no, I got shame issues. So growth leads to new layers of the onion. And so each layer, now more change is needed. And it gets very frustrating to realize I'm doing all this change, to realize I got to do more change. Okay? And then all of our old stuff comes back. So this is starting to feel boring, and I'm feeling like I like a little bit of chaos and drama to spice stuff up. So I love the story of the Israelites coming out of slavery. And 6 months in, they said, we want to go back to Egypt. Why? Because they got garlic there, and they got onions and cucumbers. They got spice. They got excitement again. And so there's something in us. When you come out of complex trauma, your default setting is chaos. Your default setting is drama. And so this is starting to feel boring. You get up every morning, you do your prayer, your meditation, you go to a meeting, you call your sponsor, you go to, come on, spice it up a little bit. So there's all of those things begin to happen. And so what happens for a lot of people, they reach a point in here where they go, I think this was better than the change. This is too hard. What they don't know is if they just hung in there a little longer, all of this would start to have more and more positives. And so what you'll find all the time is here clients are all excited about growing, and then all of a sudden it's like they're just losing interest in changing. They're just starting to question, is this worth the effort? This is so much work. I get such opposition at home now. My partner doesn't like me anymore and is all constantly on me, wanting me to go drink with him, etc. And they just get to this place where they go, you know what, this is just too hard. Back to here. So the challenge, I think, in teaching complex trauma is you got to keep real. You got to keep it real, but you got to be encouraging and nurturing. You got to give them signs that it's worth it, and sometimes you have to affirm and validate that you see growth in them, that you see changes that they don't even see in themselves, because usually they don't. And so we are their mirror right now, we are their parent right now. And they actually will begin to look to you as being a surrogate parent. And you are the one that helps them get through this, because they don't have the tools to deal with this stuff yet. So you're there to provide all of that for them. Any questions on that?
Oh boy.
So here's my dilemma.
I don't even hear it anymore.
I've been a teacher long enough to know when everybody's reached the saturation point. And I think you're there. So if you'd like to share or just a bit of questions, I don't think there's one point in me taking you any deeper.
I have one thing. I know we read about how it takes like a couple of months or something like that for your like after you quit doing like cocaine or crack or whatever, and then your dopamine comes back. So maybe that's like just when you're like, it's
Yes.
just coming back right when you're going around that corner.
Yes, and that's
And then you're
actually
like, I give up.
a good point is for me, that's when they hit anhedonia.
Yes.
It's right in that stretch as well.
I think at some point, and I think now might be a good time, given our time, just to share your story a bit, because I'm not sure many people here know sort of you.
Okay?
And again, all this comes from you. I mean, it just is. And so I think it's just interesting to hear a bit of your story.
It's a very good question.
Can I ask one question before you get into it? Not that that's not important, but
Yeah.
just with regard to this last thing, you said it's TMC. So is that, I was just looking it up, and there's something called a trans-theoretical model.
Yes.
Is that what it is?
Change.
'Cause I just want to read about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Trans what?
Trans-theoretical model.
Theoretical?
Yeah, so it's really recognizing that everybody needs some impetus to want to change. Then once they start changing, they're so positive, but then all this wind can go out of their sails in a day. Okay, back to me. I spend a lot of time wondering if I have any complex trauma. From what I know today, I think I came from one of the healthiest families I know. We were English and so very reserved emotionally. So the one thing I didn't get, and I wish I did, was the nurturing as far as the physical nurturing. I had a mother that was extremely gracious, nurturing verbally, etc. And then the other thing was both my mom and dad are workaholics. They came with that very strict work ethic, and I never remember, still to this day, once in my life when my mom wasn't doing something with her hands. She's watching the news, she'd be knitting or doing cards. So I just had that. So the one thing that I think came out of that caused my problems in my life was that I wasn't given very good tools for handling stress. So in my young world, I was not ADHD, but I was very energetic, I never remember feeling tired. I just go constantly, and I love digging deeper, etc. And so any challenge, you just dig deeper. You don't take care of yourself. You don't know how to take care of yourself. You just push yourself. And so multitasking, I loved all of that, just fired me up. Loved the adrenaline of all of that stuff. So that was kind of how I was wired, and I was a very focused kid. I had no trouble concentrating, no trouble locking in on a subject. So when I was 11, I had a God moment, and I was at a camp with my mom and dad and siblings. My dad was speaking at the camp, and I went back to our cabin after lunch, and I was all by myself, and I was reading my Bible, and all of a sudden it was just like God spoke to me, and he said, I want you to be a pastor. And so from that moment on, I just focused at becoming a pastor. So at 12, I would get home from school, and I was very good in sports, loved athletics, but I'd get home from school and I'd study my Bible a couple hours a night. As I got older, I was spending 4-6 hours a night just studying, listening to sermons, all of that. So all this to become a pastor, and which I did when I was 25. And so that, again, driven by that, then I was married at 25. Our first child came when I was 27. And so all of those extra things were being piled on now, and I didn't have the tools. So at 32, all of a sudden I realized I was tired all the time. I couldn't cope. I was getting very depressed, and it was just really hard. So I worked with the elders of the church where I was at, and they allowed me to work part-time, and after 5 years of that, I said I just can't do that, so I had to go on disability at 37, and my whole world fell apart. I diagnosed chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia. What happened through all of that was I loved being a dad, and I was just always wanted to do stuff with the kids, create memories with the kids, love the kids, nurture the kids. All of a sudden I couldn't do any of that. So all of my kids went through complex trauma because dad was no longer in their life. He was sick, in bed, on the couch. And so they went through all of that. And so the part of what I went through there is I went down into, I call it my 4 years of my desert experience with God, or a winter, where it was like God wasn't even there anymore. I prayed, bounced off the ceiling, went to church, didn't get a thing out of it. Read my Bible, didn't get a thing out of it. And it was just this wasteland. And the only thing that would break through periodically was Christian music. It would touch my heart enough to keep me kind of going. But after I got off disability, I had to help provide for the family. So I worked on farms, minimum wage jobs just to provide for a family. And I worked on horse farms, cattle farms, and I remember many days cleaning out stalls and my heart just crying out to God, confused. And what I realized was I had to rethink my whole theology, I had to rethink my whole life and rebuild from the bottom up. And that was the most painful, difficult experience, but it was the greatest blessing God ever allowed me to go through. And so I read the Bible differently now. I read it through the eyes of pain, and I read it through the eyes of brokenness. It's amazing, the Bible wasn't written for comfortable people, it was written for people in pain. And all of a sudden, all these insights started coming. So as I was working on a farm, there was a lady at our church who was a counselor at a treatment center, and she came to me one Sunday and said, Tim, I think God wants you to be an addictions counselor. I said, I didn't get that email from God. I think you got it wrong. And so I never thought anything of it. She came back a couple months later and said, Tim, I really think God wants you to be an addiction counselor. Would you please just go for the interview? So I said, okay. So I went. They offered me a job on the spot. And I said, okay, I got health issues. I don't know what I can do, but I'll give it a whirl. But be aware that I might have to quit after a bit if it's not working out. I still remember that first week sitting in with a group of about 10 addicts, counseling, teaching, group therapy. Everything from my life, all my theology, years of study, training, all my life experiences is like everything click, 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 came together. And I said, this is where I belong. This is what God made me to do. Never look back. So that's my story. So I happen to be in the only treatment center in Canada that believed that addiction wasn't the problem, it was the symptom of deeper problems. So back then it was called second stage treatment. Winnipeg had the only place that did it. And the lady that got me into there was a wonderful Christian lady that had been working there for 25 years and had developed much of their stuff. And so she just said, here's the latest research on this, here's this, read this, prepare workshops. So she got me doing stuff on shame, childhood trauma. Back then it was adult children of alcoholics, then it went to adult children of dysfunction, and then Janet Wojtitz came up with 13 characteristics of adult children, and then I just started adding and adding and adding, and now we have 60. But that was kind of what I was exposed to, so I was always thinking, what is the underlying stuff? And then as I thought back, I was extremely analytical. I drove my mom and dad crazy, I think. I analyzed everything to death. But I became super introspective. I wanted to figure out why I did everything I did. What's my motive? Why did I do that? And I had to actually quit for a while because I got so depressed in my teens because I couldn't figure out why I kept failing so badly. But at that point, I realized God had used all of that years of analyzing to now bring it together where I analyze people and help them make sense out of their life. And so that all came together with that. And so the research and my life was all about why we do, thinking below the surface, understanding the deeper issues. So when the research around trauma came out, first as developmental trauma disorder, and then ACE, adverse childhood experiences, came out, and then complex trauma, and now it's called complex PTSD. So when that all started, I was right there when it started, and that just fit in with everything that I had been thinking, experienced, and it helped make sense out of a whole bunch of things. So that's what you guys did. You're awesome.
So what was just tell us, because I don't even know myself, what was the move from working with the government for when you sort of launched into your own Finding Freedom?
Okay. So I worked at a place called Tamarack Rehab, and it was a secular place, but they basically taught the Bible without the verses. So all the workshops were very Christian, and so what was your question? Yeah.
No, moving from the government to
okay.
Finding
So
Freedom.
what happened when I was there? I said to my boss, he knew I was a pastor, I said I would never initiate a conversation with anybody about Jesus, but I said, if they ask me a question, I will answer it. And he said, no problem. So what I found was clients were all dealing with this. There's got to be a spiritual piece. So they started showing up in my office almost every day. I'd get a client, can I ask you a question? And it was amazing to see what happened. And then I had 2 clients who became Christians. And they said, Tim, we love AA, but we got to get more information than just a higher power. You need to help us understand the higher power is Jesus. And we love Tamarack and all of this underlying stuff, but we want you to bring all of that together with the Christian piece. And so there was really 2 addicts that pushed me to say, at least start something. So we started 2007 Finding Freedom, which was to be a blend of the research world, the recovery world, with the 12-step world and the Christian world. And so it wasn't anything I said, oh. So what's fascinating to me is this. All the years when God was preparing me and drawing me to be a pastor, never once in my life did I think about being involved in addictions or being an addictions counselor. Never once entered my mind. I can say that very honestly. Didn't come on my radar till 2003. And then I was kind of forced into it. So it's like God kind of blindsided me with this thing. He'd been preparing for me for years. I didn't know, I thought I knew what it was for, I didn't know what. And then all of a sudden he turned a little corner on me, and there it all made sense. So yeah, it was really addicts that just pushed. So what we did with Finding Freedom is that first we did it for Christians, and we get the odd non-Christian that would come, and I just teach from the Bible and about recovery and research. But then I got very concerned because a lot of non-Christians were coming, oh, this is too Christian for me, and stop. So I go, how do I influence that group? So we started 2 Finding Freedoms, one for Christians, one totally science. Totally research around complex trauma and addiction. And both of those continued to operate. And it was, what people began to realize is that, because I got a lot of criticism, oh, you're just doing a science when you got to be preaching the gospel. I'm like, hang in there, let God work. And what happened is they're being in a community, they're being with people where they're feeling safe and loved unconditionally. And they're starting to ask questions, so soon they'd be checking out the Christian one. And they'd be going to an Alpha course, and then they become a Christian. So we just saw God kind of work through all of that by meeting people where they're at, not where we want them to be, and then letting Him take them along the journey. Okay.
That's good.
I'm excited about being here.
Glad you're here.